Hey YouTube, Mr. Terry here, back once again to watch episode 2 of World War Simplified's World War II. If you did not see part 1, go into the description and you can see our first video. Now make sure, please, to support the original content creators by going to the original video there as well. If you're only going to do one, like and subscribe today. Rather have it be the content creators, but hopefully you stick around and we can watch more videos, history videos like this. Comments are always encouraged. If you have anything you think I should check out, make sure to put that in the comments as well. So let's go ahead and start part 2.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive Tripartite Pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure.
You know, it's so easy and common that people just look at either the European theater or maybe the Pacific theater. But I understand this is a world war. Basically, all continents are getting involved. And you can see this is still an era, especially for the British or the French, that they're still empires. They still have colonies. Yeah, a lot of empires ended after World War I, but not for the allies of World War I, like France and Great Britain, who are going to, bring in their allies or their colonies to become allies and use their resources, their manpower. So that is easy to gloss over, I think, but it shouldn't be.
Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine. So he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies.
It's worth noting that Roosevelt has now been in multiple terms. He is, he got elected back in the early 30s and is, continue on. The Great Depression was going on, and so America financially was struggling, at this time, and it would not have been a popular opinion, again, to go into the war. Kind of similar to World War I, a lot of Americans are very reluctant. It took years for American support to eventually get to that. And I think one thing World War I left with Americans was to stay out of European affairs. Europe's a mess. Stay out of it, of course, unless clearly provoked. So you can see, though, once again, the Americans are going to, say, man, we're neutral or whatever, but, and I'm saying this as an American, but, of course, the almighty dollar prevails, and there's a lot of money to be had in war. And as you can see, the Americans are going to try to profit from that as well. And, of course, brings in a key question, and I like to ask my students this, is this. If you are selling war goods to obviously one side of the war, are you truly neutral in that war? You may think of that if you're the selling nation saying, no, we're just doing business or whatever. But if you're the other nation, it looks very provocative. It's like you're supplying our enemy, and this is war, and giving supplies to an enemy is not something you can afford as somebody at war. So that's something I think to remember when you're looking at the opposite side of the Allies here, is what the Americans have been doing financially.
With food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pikecrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pikecrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pikecrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room.
Never heard of this.
Then they tried to make a pikecrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea.
Yeah.
In the end, Alan Turing and his team of
awful.
codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt. And they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic people.
Yeah, so people ask, and we talk about this in class, going back to part 1, if you saw part 1 and if you know about World War II history, Stalin and Hitler made that pact, right, non-aggression pact, and were both jointly end up invading Poland. And the strategic advantage, of course, for the Germans for that was to try to avoid a two-front war, right? Something that in World War I, the Germans had to do with. And since they had to do a two-front war, it led it basically to a stalemate. So the question would have been if they had never had to fight Russia, even though the Russians pull out of the war not very long into World War I, but if they had not had to fight them in general, would World War I have been far more successful for the Germans? And it's possible, for sure. But so the question is Hitler knows that not having to fight a two-front war is really helpful. So when he made that non-aggression pact, did he do that, again, with the mindset that he would eventually invade Russia? Now, he has successfully taken care, basically, of Western Europe, minus the lack of success of the Blitz and an invasion of Britain. So is that kind of his plan now? Is, okay, Western Front is done. Okay, now it's time to invade the East. And especially beneficial this time because the Russians would not be expecting it. And you go back to Hitler's philosophies early on, they talk about Lebensraum again, this idea that this post-German society or post-war German society would need literal living space, which is what the word means. And Russia was going to provide that living space for the expansion of the German race. But was he so confident that he thought that since they were going to be unprepared, that they would actually be able to defeat Russia completely? And now history has told us invading Russia is very difficult. It's been failed, many times. I can look up Napoleon's campaign in Russia, which doomed him. But Hitler obviously seems confident this actually can work.
Peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it.
Very close.
It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold.
Yep.
Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give
Everybody
up before
underestimates
winter, but they
the
kept
Russian
fighting.
winter.
His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No. Keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine. Keep going."
That's
"We're
the
having to
biggest
leave the
mistake.
corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." Perfectly normal. Keep going. Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being
this
pushed
winter
back.
for this next wave of Russian soldiers, the reinforcements that coming from Siberia, fighting here in the winter is nothing to them. And there's no one like that really in the world that is better acclimated to fight in the winter as these troops that are just getting sent in right now. And just like Napoleon, Hitler is completely underestimating the winter. I think they think, oh, we have winters in here in Western Europe, so we can fight in the winter, but it does not compare to a Russian winter. And for the Russians, it's not difficult at all for them to fight in this. It's very simple. Their whole society is grown up in this type of climate. So again, another bad decision, overconfidence, and lack of respect for weather, I guess. And you'll see it's not going to end well here.
They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem.
Unlike Germany, Japan has to get foreign resources. I mean, to an extent, maybe Germany does, but Japan absolutely does. They do not have the natural resources to fuel and fund what their ambitions are of creating this kind of Pan-Asian empire here. They have to get it, especially with oil. Their war machine is not sufficed by what oil Japan has back at home. It has to go and get it from other areas. Otherwise, it's over for them. So that's going to fuel their aggression even more, is this need for more and more resources. They've been getting it with China, but they need even more, especially when it comes to oil. And this is where, of course, heads are going to clash with the Americans over this issue, as I'm sure they're going to bring up here.
Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan.
They seem to have glossed over the oil issue, though. So over here is the Philippines, right? The Philippines are an American colony here. And this area around Southeast Asia is very oil rich. And the Americans had, and many nations had, not supported, of course, what Japan was doing with their invasions of Asia. And it's very important to understand this, that the Americans put in an oil embargo, meaning they were not going to sell oil to Japan as, I guess, kind of a punishment for what Japan had been doing here in the 30s. With this aggressive imperial expansion here. So Japan gets their oil, from what I understand, I may be wrong on this, but the highest percentage of foreign oil that they get is actually from America. So America putting on this oil embargo was a huge crippling effect, had a huge crippling effect for Japan. So that only means a couple things. Is one, they can try to negotiate a deal so that the Americans will open up this oil trade. And actually, from what I understand, here on the eve of Pearl Harbor, that was actually happening. They were doing these diplomatic negotiations, but I'm not sure really what the point of success was for these. But plan 2 would be to go and forcibly try to get oil-rich Southeast Asian nations in general. So what you're going to see is Japan to, I don't know whether it could be whether to intimidate the Americans or in a way, or at least cripple the fleet, like the oversimplified people are saying, is cripple the naval fleet early so that they can go into other areas down here in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, etc., and be able to get that oil, hopefully a little more easily. Of course, it's going to make them possibly look like a big time aggressor and sort of the bad guy. And at this time, of course, America has not officially declared war, so that's a risk. Apparently, the Japanese are willing to take here, and Pearl Harbor was the effect of that. Pearl Harbor here in Hawaii, of course, contains the largest fleet of the American Navy at anywhere in the Pacific is right here. So it does have a strategic location in it. A successful attack here could cripple the American Navy for a long time to come, which of course would make it easier for Japan then to go into these oil-rich nations and take them over and fuel their military even more with more resources. But I think that's very important to understand is why is Japan attacking America?
And so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, No, you stay. The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory.
Battle of Stalingrad. Probably the most important battle of the war, arguably. Stalingrad, casualty-wise, is around 2 million troops, which very likely can put it at the bloodiest military battle in not just a World War II, like they said, but possibly human history. The lengths that both Stalin and Hitler went to the city was incredible. And Stalin, his namesake city, he was not going to let that go at any cost whatsoever. And the Russian losses were far worse than the German losses, but that's going to be in total in World War II with Russia. They're going to have far more casualties than they will, than the Germans will. But at this point of the war, anything Germany's losing is something they're going to struggle to regain, while Hitler or Stalin will continue to put in more and more. Losses at this point would be devastating, of course, for Germany, who really haven't had one yet. And the Battle of Stalingrad is the turning point of the war, especially in the Eastern Front here, as it's one of the, it's basically the only time Hitler had lost, or the first time Hitler had lost here. And from this point on, he is going to lose ground. But yeah, it didn't even make enough sense for Hitler to put as much investment into Stalingrad as he did. He's approaching Moscow, and we know Moscow's the epicenter. If you take Moscow, it's kind of it. But possibly it's just the whole namesake idea of Stalingrad that he wants to go in and take this. Maybe it's a battle of egos, you know what I mean? But nevertheless, this loss, as far as losing ground at Stalingrad, was something the Germans never recover from.
For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again, Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive the likes of which the world has never seen before invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came. As Allied...
What? You haven't played World of Warships yet? Why the hell not? Playing World of Warships will allow you to walk on water, fire at water, fire at the enemy, torpedo the Yamato, avenge the Titanic, dodge the enemy.
Hitler thought, finishing up here, Hitler thought that the invasion would be at Calais, which is actually the shortest point in the English Channel. It would make sense to have it there. Plus, there's deceptive maneuvers and things for the Allies to make it look like they were going to go to Calais. Of course, it's going to be in Normandy.
And finally,
beaches of Normandy were not nearly as fortified as probably
you
they
can
could have
imagine
been.
with World of Warships. Click here and try for yourself.
That's going to make it
free on
easier. It's still going to be a very difficult landing here in Normandy, but this made it easier in a way to not have to have as many reinforcements as there could have been.
Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany.
Now this is where the war stopped in World War I, right at the border. Once the Allies had pushed the Germans back to the actual German border, that's when the armistice went into effect. And you can tell Hitler is not looking to form a deal like that right now. He's willing to fight at Germany, which was not something the Germans were willing to do in World War I. And it looks like he's still holding hope out that there can be a victory, maybe here in the late weeks and months, that something can happen to try to turn the tide. But one thing you're going to see with the Allies is how pretty ruthless they were when they invaded here in their attacks in Germany.
Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out. 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
So the decision to use the atomic bomb was, twofold, really. After, these battles on these islands south of Japan, we saw how the Japanese resolve was just incredible. It's not part of their culture to surrender, right? Even if it's militarily maybe a better idea, it's dishonorable. So having to literally fight to the last person on the islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa basically made the Americans think that just a surrender is not going to happen, and it would require an incredible amount of bloodshed on both sides to do this. So that's, the common narrative, especially with the atomic bomb, and why that was used to maybe save lives in the end, if you want to look at it that way, to avoid having to do a massive invasion, which, when they talk about what would have been required to do a mainland invasion of Japan, probably would have required the largest amphibious invasion probably in history, dwarfing, probably the D-Day invasion. And those numbers, again, when they start talking about them, would be appalling. Now, the other thing, though, that is important to understand about the use of the atomic bomb was the whole Russia idea. And that is this, the Allies, the Western Allies, Britain and the Americans, absolutely do not trust Stalin. Even though they've been working with him and allied with the war, they do not trust really Stalin in the post-war world, especially with all these new territories that he has conquered, or conquered in a way, but invaded to get into Germany. Did not think that they would be vacated afterwards, and they knew that there could be an issue definitely with Stalin afterwards. So the use of the atomic bomb, as the Americans were the first to develop it, was also probably used to, I guess, impress, if that's the right word, or intimidate the Russians in a way, that this is something the Americans have and will use if necessary. So again, there's kind of a twofold approach of using this atomic bomb. All right, let's finish up.
The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press, to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me. And your app is doing really well. And this quesadilla you made is to die for. How'd you learn to do all this stuff? I used the link in the description to get 2 months of Skillshare for just 99 cents. Wow, tell me more. Okay. Skillshare is an online learning community with more than 19,000 classes in design, business, technology, and more. Premium membership gives you unlimited access to high-quality classes taught by genuine experts working in their field, so you can improve your skills, unlock new opportunities, and do the work you love. If you want to learn how to create games, you can check out the courses on using Unity or creating vector art. There are courses for software development, music production, arts and crafts, or if you want to learn how to animate like I do, you can find loads of courses for beginning animation. And Skillshare won't take a heavy toll on your wallet compared to other learning platforms, with an annual subscription being under $10 a month. If you'd like to give it a try first, then I've got a deal just for Oversimplified viewers. The first 1,000 people to use this link, which can also be found in the description, will get their first 2 months of Skillshare for just 99 cents. That's right, just 1 cent short of $1. So be sure to sign up using the link in the description, improve your skills, and learn something new today.
Okay, thanks again for watching. Once again, really liked what they are doing here, and with this video series, it's great. And definitely, again, like I said at the beginning of the video, please support the original creators by going to their link, give them the like and subscribe that they deserve. And you saw they're going to lead into the Cold War, and we'll definitely have to get to their episodes on the Cold War, and looking forward to that. So once again, thanks for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them there. If you have any video suggestions, leave them there too, and see if I can get around to it. All right, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.